every air conditioning system needs something to prevent the evaporator from freezing. In an automotive air conditioning system, this is done either with a thermostat. It could be done with a valve like one of these, a suction valve. It can be done with a switch like this, where it bypasses based on pressures and clutch cycling systems. Or even like this, where it's got pretty much every valve in the system all in one place. A POA valve like this, it bypasses on pressure. So your system is going to be divided into a high and low side. This valve sits on the low side, and when pressure going into this valve from here exceeds 30 psi, it's going to bypass. And by bypassing, it'll be as if nothing is in here. That prevents your evaporator from freezing up until your system pressure comes back up to 30 psi. And that's as this was designed. In a 134A system, we calibrate these to where they bypass right about 20 psi. And it's the same function. It's just a lower setting because the refrigerant requires it. Most of these are POA valves or some form of them. Essentially, everything you see from here to here is a suction valve, and they are designed. These valves are designed to cycle the system when it gets to that pressure I spoke about earlier. In this valve, you can actually calibrate it by screwing in and out, and that will adjust your low side pressure. These were used on roughly 62 to 66 on most models, on most GM models, and it was only used on GM cars. The POA valves were actually used on 60, 65, 66 to about 7 or 74. Some models used it longer, some used it less. What you're looking at here, this is because these valves, when they function, it's a great design, but they have a tendency to be real finicky. If there's a little bit, even the slightest amount of contamination in it, that will get in there and it'll actually clog open to where it'll be in constant bypass mode. Whereas this eliminates the need. This actually turns it into a constantly bypassing system, but your pressure switch, when your pressure hits a certain point, will actually open a circuit to the wire leading out to the compressor. And in that way, it's going to cycle your system like a late model car. Something that they went to after this, VIR, stands for Valves in Receiver. This is really another great, at least idea, that ultimately didn't pan out. I only ran it for a few years, 2-3 years, before they went to the type of system they currently use now, clutch cycling system, that this converts your early model cars to, where your system is cycling based on your cycling switch. The difference between a factory original and a rebuilt valve is pretty minor. Basically, when we rebuild these valves, we trim down this ring here until we can actually separate it. They're actually soldered together at the time of assembly. We have to actually trim this down in a lathe in order to get these things apart, then go through all the individual components in order to replace what's necessary to get the valve back to functional. In the end, it'll look something like this. So to most people, they'll never notice the difference. To a very picky judge, where you're having this judged on a points basis, this is what you can see as far as the difference. It's not that much, but if you're really looking at them side by side, you can see the difference. Again, most people, they wouldn't know if you didn't tell them. The beads that we put on these are nearly perfect, to where someone might not even consider that it was welded together. But it's fully functional now, as if this was a brand new part. You put it on your car. As long as that system that you're installing this on is clean and free of contaminants, these things will last forever. That's generally what happens. Either contaminants are going to ruin these valves, they again make them stick open, or not changing your filter dryer each and every time the system's open up, because moisture then will cause that to rust. Again, once it sticks open, it stays open. The only way to fix it is to cut it open and rebuild it once again. There are two other kind of valves. This is a similar valve, what we call a Delco replacement valve. It was made to, when these were getting phased out, when Frigidaire was no longer making them, and they became either a cheaper alternative, another alternative, and eventually the only alternative to finding a new old stock version of this. It's a, as you can see, it's quite a bit different visually. You see one of these on your car, unlike the difference between these two valves, you'll notice that this doesn't look the same. They often have a little plastic ring around them too, so the strap can attach to it. Alternatively, we have a POA Eliminator. These were designed to basically act as if the POA valve is not here. They use this clutch cycling switch to regulate, to read pressure, much in the same way that your POA valve does. But this reads pressure, and instead of bypassing pressure, where your compressor is constantly running, this actually cuts the circuit open and prevents power to the compressor. Your compressor clutch disengages, and while your pulley's turning, the compressor is not on. Once your pressures get within normal limits, to prevent the evaporator from freezing up, your circuit will close, and now your compressor will turn back on. If you have a POA valve, then you need to have it restored back to functioning, where we could do a job something like this. Really, it's pretty simple. We do dozens of these every week, and essentially you're going to send that to us. You go to originalair.com, you click on the rebuild form, you attach that form with the valve, send it to us, and we'll go through and rebuild it and get it to where all you have to do is install and use it. Process depends on the time of year, but for the most part the process takes about a week and a half, as much as a couple of weeks in our peak season. If you're sending your POA valve in to us to be rebuilt, we'll usually have to know whether you're going to be charging your system with either R12, which is the older refrigerant, or newer refrigerant 134A. Either way, we can set it, but it has to be calibrated one way or the other. So if you use this valve as it sits, as it rolls off the assembly line, in fact, this is a new old stock part, so as soon as set for R12, you're going to end up having a valve that freezes up, because instead of bypassing at 20 pounds of pressure, it's going to bypass at 30 pounds of pressure. There's the problems. So it won't work for both refrigerants. It's one or the other. You have to set this for either R12 or 134A.